Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started for those who were very prompt and for our very special guest today. So, Ruth, welcome to Law Student Ministries at Christian Legal Society inaugural wellness event. So thank you for being our speaker today and kicking this very much needed program off. And everybody, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, law students, attorneys. Thank you for taking the space to have this moment to let God do the work that He wants to do in our hearts and hear from our special guest today. So, Ruth, without any further ado, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and share some of your story with us, your story of how you got here, what has been your journey to get here, to be a very well-known author, speaker, and director of the Transforming Center.
Well, I'm Ruth Haley Barton, and I am founder and CEO of the Transforming Center, which is a ministry that reaches out to pastors and leaders and influencers, helping them to strengthen the soul of their leadership, which means to forge a stronger connection between their soul and their leadership. And it, really comes out of my own need. I mean, all the things that I write about are things that I've needed myself, that I've needed to learn, and that I'm still needing to practice. And so it's been a very organic thing for me. It's not been some sort of a strategic vision, like I want to be this or I want to be that. It's unfolded much more organically in my life. I've been a leader for a long time, and there have been really specific moments in my life where I recognized that I needed to forge a stronger connection between what I was doing outwardly and what God was doing within me. And I believe that that's the greatest need that any leader has, is to strengthen and forge a strong relationship between their soul, which is the place where God is present to us, and whatever it is that they do in the external world. And that when those two things get disconnected, it can be a pretty dangerous place for any of us to be. And so I think my whole emphasis is to help us keep that relationship strong between the soul of us and what it is that we're doing in the external world.
Thank you for sharing that. I personally want to say thank you. Back in 2019, I did your Sacred Rhythms Bible study, and it was transformative in my journey and in my walk with the Lord. And I instituted those rhythms and read your book also about solitude, and went on solitude retreats, which is part of my regular rhythm. So personally, I would like to say thank you for that.
Oh, well, you're welcome, and thanks be to God.
Amen. So the inaugural launch of the wellness program, we know that the American Bar Association really has put the issue of mental health and wellness for both law students and attorneys front and center. It's a big concern. It's a big issue. Both law students and attorneys are turning to substances to deal with the pressures that they face, that they're under. And so this whole program is based off of John 4:14, which tells us, "But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring," or many versions will also say well, "within them, giving them eternal life." So really, hence the name of our program, because we're just really thinking about Jesus being that well and being that spring of life for us. So In your book, your most recent book, Embracing Rhythms, you make the statements, there is a kind of hurry that is a form of violence exercised upon time that is detrimental to our health, to our families, our communities, and to our relationship with God. Living under pressure is part of life. Still, we have to be careful not to rationalize. God did not make a mistake in creating time. He made enough of it. How would embracing rhythms set in motion a change in how we view time and respond to it?
Mhm. Well, first of all, let me just mention that the full title of the book is Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest from Sabbath to Sabbatical and Back Again. And so I am going to be putting forward Sabbath as the kingpin of a life well lived in God and as a rhythm that God himself has instituted for us. And then those words that you just quoted are the words from Ron Rolheiser in his foreword. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. So those are his words. And I do believe that an orientation towards Sabbath is more than a lifestyle suggestion. And I think this is a really important point. I'm not sure how we as Christians have gotten to the place where we think that something that God has made so clear in scripture is something that is a mere suggestion. you know, the Sabbath is not a suggestion. The Sabbath is a gift from God. It is something that emerges from God's own nature. This is how God does God's life, and God doesn't need rest. And yet God ceases on the seventh day. So this rhythm of work and rest. And I wanted both of those words to be in the title of this new book because I do believe that it is about the rhythm, that the rhythm, the goodness, the beauty is in the rhythm. We're not trying to diminish the importance of work. Work is really important. It's an opportunity to partner with God and God's purposes in the world. But God is the one who says that there's a certain rhythm that honors and acknowledges the way I have made you. God is our creator. And God knows how it's best for us to live. And so the Sabbath is something that emerges out of God's own character, then something that God shares with the people that God loves. And so the first people he shared it with were the Israelites, were the Jews, but it's not really primarily an ethnic thing. It's not associated just with the Jewish tradition. It's associated with who God is. It's in God's nature to practice these rhythms. And then when God calls forth a people for himself, he gives us this rhythm as a gift. And so I really do believe that in really wrestling with God's gift of Sabbath, that we do reorient ourselves in time. In fact, some people talk about Sabbath keeping as being a tithe of our time, like many of us know about the tithing of our money, but that the Sabbath is actually a tithe of our time. It's the time that we give back to God. And, in our culture, time is money, right? And so it's a way in which we honor God with our time, with the time of our lives. And so as Christians, I do think that honoring God with this most precious commodity that we have, time, is a basic aspect of our Christian discipleship. And it's a great gift too. And we'll probably get into that as this conversation unfolds. But for now, I'll just talk about allowing God to be the Lord of our time and allowing our relationship with God to actually inform how we do time. And in fact, I think our use of time, our poor use of time, our unwillingness to be disciplined with time is actually a place of cultural conformity, where we as Christians are actually conforming to the culture versus being the salt that is needed in our culture. And I think that the Sabbath keeping in particular is such a countercultural practice that we actually resist culture and confront culture when we're willing to do time the way that God has given us to do it.
Was there a specific moment or situation that you felt impressed upon to write this book? And if there was, would you mind sharing and elaborating on that with us?
Well, the topic of Sabbath has been a thread throughout my writings, and that's something I always pay attention to. So there is a chapter in Sacred Rhythms on Sabbath keeping. There's a chapter in Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership on Sabbath, and now there's a whole book on Sabbath. So it shows that this is something that really matters to me. and because I can't not write about it. I just can't seem to stop myself, And part of the reason for that, and the way that I open up this book, is that I really do believe that Sabbath keeping has saved my life. And that I wouldn't be here today doing what I'm doing at the level I'm doing it if it wasn't for Sabbath. But it wasn't always that way. I was a young, ambitious leader, and for a long time kicked Sabbath to the curb. I'm a pastor's kid, and so we had practiced Sabbath, but in a very legalistic way. I didn't appreciate how it had been practiced in my own home. It wasn't fun. It wasn't delightful. It wasn't even restful because we were the pastor's family and we were always having people over. And, we worked very, very hard on the Sabbath. So I didn't understand all the good gifts of Sabbath keeping. So I had actively avoided it and kicked it to the curb once I became a young adult. And, then as I became a young adult, I had all my ambitions and I felt like Sundays were just a really good day to study and to catch up on things and to do all the things I couldn't do during the work week. And plus, I was ambitious and I wanted to use every moment that I had to get better at doing whatever I was going to do in the world. And so I ignored Sabbath as a practice until I was in my early 40s. And then in my early 40s, I was tired. I was reading books on Sabbath. I was longing for a way of life that worked and a more restful existence. But I didn't know how to make it happen. I was married with 3 young children and I had my own job and I was in graduate school. And so I could not figure out how to do it. So I just kept putting it in the too hard file. But then God, what I would say, knocked me off my horse. I had a biking accident in my early 40s, and it was during that time of recovery that I really began to pay attention to my longing for rest and my longing for a way of life that worked. And Wayne Mueller has this incredible quote in his book on Sabbath where he says that if we do not practice Sabbath, then our accidents and our illness and our cancers will become Sabbath for us. And that quote just kept buzzing around in my mind like a fly buzzing against a window pane. I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't ignore this truth that I had had something happen in my life that was now creating a Sabbath for me. And God used that time for me to get in touch more deeply with my desire for a way of life that works. And I began to really look at whether or not this Sabbath that had been in the too hard file for a while might become something that could give me a better way of living than I was living at the time.
Wow, then now I have no questioning why it was you that, the Lord put front and center to do this inaugural event, because, I think so many of our law students and attorneys can identify with what you just said. So what would you say to the law student who's feeling the pressure of assignments, being in grad school, doing internships, studying and sitting for the bar exam, and juggling life? How would they be able to reframe how they view time and respond to it?
Yeah. Well, when the Sabbath was first given, it was given to the Israelites, as we know, and there are these dynamics that are contained within Sabbath keeping. There are reasons why it's formative and transformative for us. And one of the first dynamics that went along with Sabbath keeping for the Israelites was facing into the issue of trust. Who am I trusting for my security, for what I need in life? Am I trusting myself? Am I trusting my own human efforts, or am I willing to trust God one day a week? And so I don't think there's any way to talk about Sabbath in the context of my life and what you just described without talking about trust. Am I going to be willing to trust God that if God knows what's best for me, and that is, giving the 7th day as a day for ceasing my work, productivity, mastery, all of that. Like the whole inner dynamic of Sabbath is that we are giving up control of mastery, of productivity, of achievement, all of those things. We are ceasing the dominion, having dominion over the earth. God gave us dominion. We're supposed to do that for 6 days, but on the 7th day, we're supposed to give all that up and trust God with our very lives. So the first thing we're going to have to confront is, are we willing to trust God with our lives? Are we willing to trust God because God created us and God knows what we need? And am I willing to trust that God, the God who expanded the 5 loaves and 2 fishes to be enough for 5,000 men plus women and children? Am I willing to trust that God can make the time available in 6 days a week enough for what God is calling me to do? Now, of course, there's a question in there. Am I thinking that God is calling me to too much? Is God calling me to so much in life that I have to give up one of God's basic rhythms for me? Or do I need to even relook at all I'm trying to do right now? I mean, it actually reorients us in terms of what comes first, my calling or the rhythms that God has put in place for me. So I think we have to look at trust first, which is an inner dynamic. It's not just about imposing my will on time. It's about whether or not I'm willing to open up to the possibility of trusting God, that if I do what God has instructed me to do by working 6 days and then ceasing on the seventh, will God make it enough? Can God expand the hours that are in those 6 days to make it enough for what God is calling me to do? And then if I have to look at calling, I might have to look at that too. you know, it's very challenging. I talk about the fact that Sabbath is a practice that will mess with you, and it will. It will mess with everything about your life. It'll mess with your priorities. It will mess with, how you're doing time. It will mess with your community's life if you're part of a community. The Sabbath is a practice that will mess with you, but it will also save your life. And Barbara Brown Taylor has asked this wonderful question: what is saving your life these days? And my answer is and has been, the Sabbath is saving my life week after week after week after week. So I think there's even the question of who's in charge of my life. Am I in charge of my life with all of my ambitions? Or am I willing to let God be God in my life? And God, as my creator, has said to me as a beloved child, I know what's best for you. And it's working 6 days and ceasing on the seventh. Do you trust me? Can we walk into this together? Can we look at all the knotty, KNOTTY? Can we look at all these knotty issues together? Do you trust me enough to lean into this great gift that I'm trying to give you? I think that we are a lot like children, like 2 and 3-year-olds who are being offered a nap, and they say, no, I don't need a nap. I want to keep doing this or that. And in the end, there's this great gift, which now as an adult, I would say, bring it on, give me the nap. But as a 2 or 3-year-old, as an immature child, I was not willing to receive the gift of rest. But now as an adult, am I willing to receive God's gift of rest and ceasing? We have to cease in order to rest. And the word Shabbat actually means to cease.
So if a student is at the point of that trusting relationship and ready to give everything over to the Lord, what would be a starting point for if they're wondering, okay, what's the next step? How do I begin to establish rhythms? What would you suggest there for them?
Well, a couple of things. One is to do something before you do everything. I mean, this is such a radical, Sabbath is such a radical practice that is, by the way, connected with also God's understanding of our limitations as human beings. And I think there's a kind of grandiosity that we engage in when we refuse to rest, the way God has invited us to rest. We're saying, maybe, and I remember thinking this, I remember thinking this in my early 30s, that I don't need a rest. I've got all this strength and I've got all this energy. Sabbath is just for retired people, people who aren't very important, people who don't have much to do. Well, that is grandiosity, clearly that is grandiosity for me as the creature to say to my creator, you don't know what I need. I know what I need. That is grandiosity at best. So, I do think though that because Sabbath is so radical, Sabbath keeping is so radical as a way of ordering time, that we sometimes might need to do something before we do everything. So here's a couple of ideas for doing something before you do everything. Maybe you really at this moment can't imagine taking a whole 24 hours, which is really what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be 24 hours, but maybe you're not able to do that. Could you start with an afternoon? Could you start with an evening? Could you start with a morning and say these moments, this 3-hour block of time, this 3 or 4 hour block of time is going to be my Sabbath time. And during this period of time, I'm not going to work. I'm not going to study. I'm not going to try to master anything. I'm not going to try to achieve anything. I'm going to rest myself in God the way that God is inviting me to. And so it doesn't have to be a Sunday. It might be another day of the week. Although for many people, Sunday is the only day where there's even a possibility that anything could be different, but maybe it could be a Saturday. But maybe there's a shorter block of time than 24 hours that you could start with. and expand from there. Another way we can do something before we do everything is to set one day way out in the future and say that day out there in the future is going to be my first attempt at a Sabbath. And in the book, I actually give people really strong and clear guidance for how to shape your Sabbath time, what to include, what to exclude. And so you pick a day way out there that is doable. And then you say, that's the day. And if you live with others, like if you're married and you have family, or maybe even if you have roommates, you actually let others know and see if they even want to join you. Would we all want to join together in putting together a Sabbath day that's based on delight and joy and rest and ceasing and resisting the cultural influences that have got us so caught up in their grip? We could do it together with others that we live with, but we set it out in the future, a day that does seem doable, and we do it once, and then we let it unfold from there. Because I can assure you that once you begin, it's going to start to be so delightful. You're going to feel the goodness of it, the dynamics of it, that in most cases, you're going to want to figure out how to have this rhythm in your life, because even a taste of it is so good that you can't imagine. You don't even want to live life, any other way.
It was so refreshing to me to hear how you termed that in your book, Sabbath Delight. I just love thinking about that and hearing that. And so hearing you say that now, and you devoted a whole chapter to it in the book, would you speak to that here and expound upon Isaiah 58:13-14?
Yeah. Do you have those verses in front of you? Because I think it'd be great to read them.
I can get them quickly.
Yeah.
Bring those up.
And let's read those, because I think that's where the word delight is introduced into this whole practice.
And it's going to be the New Living Translation.
Okay.
Okay, I'm getting there. Okay. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Don't pursue your own interest on that day, but enjoy the Sabbath and speak of it with delight as the Lord's holy day. Honor the Sabbath in everything you do on that day, and don't follow your own desires or talk idly. Then the Lord will be your delight. I will give you great honor and satisfy you with the inheritance I promised your ancestor Jacob. I, the Lord, have spoken.
Yeah. And I'll read it from the new RSV too, so that we get all these fine nuances. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interests on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, and that's what I'm calling it a delight. If you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or serving your own interests or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. So this idea of delight, it is life-changing to think about the Sabbath as a delight versus a legalistic thing that we must do. And yet that is how the scriptures call it. And for me, to think about a day, first of all, to step back and say, what are the things I delight in? What are the things that I delight in just because that's how God has made me? And when I'm actually with people in a classroom environment or a seminar environment, we actually take some time to say those things out loud. What is delightful for me? For me, to have a day, I am a P on the Myers-Briggs. So to have a day where there's no schedule is the best thing that can happen to me on any day. To have no schedule, that is the most delightful thing that I can think of, because as you know, P's on the Myers-Briggs really love for things to unfold and be spontaneous and all of that. So that's the best thing about Sabbath for me. That's the most delightful thing about Sabbath for me, is when there is no schedule. And then I can let it unfold. And so to take a walk where you don't have a time frame, no destination, to take it slow, to lay in the sun, to lay on your couch, to sit on your own deck, to eat really, really good food. There's no dieting on Sabbath. You eat the food that you love just because you love it. To take a nap, to read a book for pleasure like a novel or a book of poetry, to go for a very long run. If you're a runner, we know that for many runners, you get into flow when you're doing a long run. And so to do a long run that's not really about mastery, but it's just about the flow that you get into. Fishing, whatever it is that just delight, a pickup game of basketball, playing on the floor with your children. I mean, or your grandchildren, depending on your age. But what is it that delights you? And then give yourself a day that's only about what you delight in, and you're delighting in God's good gifts to you. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is to exclude consumerism, shopping, being in stores, because the Sabbath is about God's most substantive gifts. When we're in stores, the whole world is oriented towards making us want things or making us dissatisfied with what we have so that we can, be motivated to buy this, that, or the other thing. Any store you walk into is going to be ordered around consumerism. So I suggest that we don't go into stores. On the Sabbath, we don't, scroll through the Amazon website or anything like that, because the point of Sabbath is to enjoy and to delight in God's good gifts to us. And those gifts, the truest gifts, are the ones that money can't buy. Your family, your friends, life in your own body, lovemaking in the afternoon if you're married, good food and cooking, the process of cooking. Now, for some people, cooking might not be delightful. So I would say then maybe, order in food ahead of time, or do the cooking ahead of time. But for me, I have a very, very full life, and to make a soup, a nourishing soup, and to chop the vegetables and feel the aromas, smell the aromas coming together and filling the house, or grilling really good steaks on the grill. That's really pleasurable to me, to actually have time to cook for the people that I love and to do some special food that we wouldn't eat on another day. So, I mean, I'm just giving you pictures. I'm just giving you snapshots of what delighting could look like. And it's really what God intends for us. God intends for us to have a day when we cease our work and we do those things that invite us. And I talk about resting also on 3 levels: body, soul, and spirit, or body, mind, and spirit. And so for law students in particular, to not study and to rest our minds, wow, that would be an incredible thing, to rest your mind on that day. And I give really, concrete examples of what it means to rest the mind. And in the book, Invitation to Solitude and Silence, I also talk a lot about resting the mind. And lawyers too, attorneys that are actively, that are actively in that profession, the mind is so busy and full and working so hard all the time that rest for the mind might be a really delightful way of looking at the Sabbath.
And so, well, just listening to you, I just sort of went, oh,
Oh, really? Can we do
like,
that?
it just sounds so, just
Mhm.
hearing it just sounds
Yeah.
so relaxing and delightful. But how can that Sabbath delight, how can that bleed over into the other days of the week to
Mhm.
bring us balanced wellness?
Mhm.
And then not only to us, but then this theme that you talk about in your book about then to the community. Like,
Yeah.
how do we then keep Sabbath with the community? How do all those things fit together?
Yeah. Well, before we talk about that, there was something else I wanted to mention in the Isaiah 58 passage that is very unique for this group, and that is that Isaiah 58, if you read it in context, it's within the context of talking about justice. If you look at the whole of Isaiah 58. So God is saying, in the midst of the most important work, because I think for God, there's nothing more important than justice. I think that justice, God is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him, Isaiah 30. God cares about the poor and the oppressed and those who have been treated unjustly. So speaking to people who are in the profession of justice and law and bringing law and, discerning all of that, the Sabbath practice is giving to those who are actively working in the field of justice. So pardon me for thinking that's actually rather humorous today. And something for us to ponder. Why does God put the Sabbath practice right in there in a chapter that's the rest of it is about justice? God is saying even the most important work, we still need to take a Sabbath, and we still need to refuse to pursue our own interests on God's holy day. So with that, I think there's a certain level of gravitas that brings to this particular setting right here, this context that we're in today, the Christian Legal Society. Um, so, um, so I think that once we begin to experience this deep kind of rest, one day a week, and it does take practice. I often say that the Sabbath is a practice that takes practice because it is so countercultural and it challenges us on so many levels. We are going to have to practice. But once we begin to experience this quality of resting, of ceasing and resting, then it's possible to bring what we're experiencing there into our everyday life. First of all, I actually came into the practice of Sabbath keeping by practicing solitude as a place of rest in God, getting smaller bits of time, like a half an hour a day, and cultivating solitude as a place of rest in God, body, mind, and soul. And then I was like, oh, this is so good. I want more of it. So it can go that way too, that we can cultivate Sabbath moments. I would call solitude cultivated as a place of rest in God as Sabbath moments. But as we become familiar with what it feels like to cease our work and to rest in God, body, mind, and soul, we can bring, snippets of that into our everyday life. We can take a moment between one appointment and the next and stop and rest ourselves in God for 60 seconds before going on to the next thing. We can take a meal sometimes, at least sometimes, as being a moment of feasting and allowing God to strengthen us in our bodies and taking it as a real break versus working through every single meal of our lives. So we can have moments then between one thing and the next that can actually give us replenishment in the context of very busy lives. But you have to feel it first. You have to feel that feeling of what it means to rest ourselves completely in God. Most of us never stop at that level, so we don't know what it feels like. But once we're getting these, longer experiences, then we can actually bring that kind of a moment, that kind of an experience into other moments of our lives.
Mm. So this last question that I'm gonna ask you before we open it up to
Mm,
Q&A from the law students
mhm.
is your work at the Transforming Center is about strengthening the soul of leaders and transforming communities. So what would you say to these law students who are going to be future leaders
Yeah.
and those attorneys who are leaders and actually our law students are leaders on their campuses?
Absolutely.
And um, they really, I think for the Christian attorney and for the Christian law student, it's harder than for those who are not Christian because they're fighting too for they're contending for their faith
Yes, yes.
individually. They're contending, and how do I be a Christian law student? How do I, you know, be a Christian attorney in the type of
Mm,
culture and society that we live in and keep my standards?
that's right.
And there's a lot of schools out there um that really don't want Christian legal society or Christian law students on their campus, and they're
Yeah.
fighting this fight. So what words would you have for them, for our lawyers who are leaders in our country, our world, by just the very nature of the profession? And like you just, spoke about so eloquently about Isaiah being about justice. So
Yeah. Hmm.
what would you say to them on that?
Well, I think you're right to say that to be a Christian law student or a Christian lawyer is more difficult because, you're working within the laws of our country, but then there's also a higher authority, right? That we are seeking to respond to in very, very complicated environments, very, very complicated situations. And we can't ever lose our sense of the higher authority that we serve and respond to. And even in the way that truth can be used or misused, or even in a situation where someone is guilty of something but they're still being represented. And I think that in the field of law there's also this sense that we want to not take responsibility unless it's been proven. So, sometimes there's this, don't say anything, don't say the truth because it might incriminate you. But we're being called to something higher than that. We're being called to live in truth. So I think you're right that there are unique challenges for people that are in the legal profession. Um, and so I think we must keep cultivating our relationship with God at that level, that's our ultimate authority in life. And there are moments where real discernment is needed, and real discernment comes through the cultivation of our relationship with God, so that we don't just get caught up in a system and in the way that the system works, but we're very, very clear on where, where our true authority lies and rests. And that's in the relationship with God and cultivating that relationship. Um, so that would be the most important thing. And I think there's I think we need to see ourselves as always transforming and always learning. And so one of the things that I say in our setting is that the best thing we bring to leadership is our own transforming self. And so real ongoing attention to our own transformation, because that will transform the circles that we are a part of. Our presence will be transforming just because we are continuing to attend to our own transformation and our own integrity within these things. And so I think that there's also a sense of cultivating the fact that we're partnering with God in the work of justice, which is what non-Christian attorneys are not going to have that same sense. But I talked about the title in my book as being Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, because work is an important arena where we experience ourselves to be partnering with God. And because God is a God of justice, then there is a very special sense of partnering with God in my work in justice. And so I would also definitely encourage cultivating a sense that I'm partnering with God in this work, that justice is something that God cares about, and I am partnering with God in it. And so continue to cultivate a deep sense of spirituality in the work of being involved in the legal system, that we have a partner. We're not alone in this work. We have a partner, and our partner is God, and what we're doing, God really cares about. And then God is also saying, you're not going to be able to do this work if you don't keep a Sabbath. As important as this work is, you will not be able to do it and do it well without a Sabbath practice. And I think we all know that those who get involved with justice and social justice issues, but do that disconnected from a sense of their spirituality and the source. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about the interior resources that God gives us for the work of justice, that if we don't continue to cultivate our spirituality, we will not have the inner resources to be sustained for the long haul. We will flame out because the work of justice is so hard and so challenging and dangerous, shall we just say. It's also dangerous in many ways. So many of our civil rights leaders actually lost their lives in the work for justice. And so to stay connected with our inner resources, and Sabbath is one of the ways of doing that, is also to me extremely important, to stay connected with our source.
So I'm going to switch our view to gallery view, and we're going to take the students' questions. Okay. So the first one I have here is, what are some specific examples of how law students can practice tithing their time for Sabbath during seasons where there is such a scarcity of time?
Yeah. Well, I have not been to law school, so I don't want anybody to think that I'm speaking from experience here. But I do know there are many, many kinds of students. And I think, for students, studying is your work, and the Sabbath command or the Sabbath gift still remains. And so to have moments in our lives when we withdraw from the work of being a student, is still really important. And so I don't know what day it would be for you. I don't know if classes are held on Sundays and things like that, or if there's another day or another block of time, a 3 or 4 hour block of time. But it's really as simple as saying there needs to be a block of time when we are unplugging from work, when we're not trying to develop mastery over anything, we're not trying to achieve anything, we're not trying to be productive in any way, but we are ceasing and resting ourselves in God. And there's something about Sabbath keeping that's very counterintuitive. It sounds really counterintuitive to say, I may in the end be more productive if I rest. It's counterintuitive, but it's actually true, because we bring a fresher mind than a renewed mind to the work that we do. And so in my book, Invitation to Solitude and Silence, I actually talk about a physician who said that when he was exhausted and he would try to be present with a patient, he would have to rely on testing, lots of testing and things like that in order to come up with a diagnosis. But when he was rested, he was able to really be present with the student, or not with the student, but with his patient. And through presence and through a rested mind, he was able to actually discern what was needed in that patient's treatment and in that patient's life. And I really do believe that. I'm always shocked and amazed at what it means to come to my work fresh after the Sabbath, and how it changes the quality of my work to come to it fresh after having rested versus coming to it exhausted from continuing to just, you know, beat away at it. And so all I can say is we're going to have to trust God here and look at our weeks. I will say that sometimes a floating Sabbath is what's needed, but I don't love it. Um, because I think the human body is wired to need this rest on every seventh day. So if you have a floating Sabbath, it's going to mean that there are some times when you go beyond the seventh day, and you then really do run the risk of becoming dangerously tired and being less effective and um, more on the edge. So if there is any way to have it be regular, the human body is regulated towards rhythms. We eat 3 times a day. There's seasons, there's tides, there's all sorts of things that happen in rhythm. For us as human beings, we are wired and made to live within rhythms. And so if there's any way for it to be a regular rhythm where you're not trying to figure it out every week, that will be helpful, because your body will start to lean towards it and actually feel it. Just like, you may not be aware of what time it is, but your body says, I'm hungry, it's lunchtime, because your body is oriented towards rhythms. That will start to happen around your resting rhythms. You'll start to feel it. Oh, I've been working 6 days really hard. I'm really knowing that I need that day of rest because my body is used to it, and your body starts to signal it for you and invite you in. Now, what I find in my own life, I mean, and I have a very big life myself. It's different than being a law student, but I have a very, very demanding life, and I have lots of deadlines and lots of projects and lots of expectations in my life. But there'll be some weeks where I'll say, well, maybe I could just do a little work on Sunday. Sunday is my Sabbath. Maybe I could just do a little work. And now that I'm a mature Sabbath keeper, I've been keeping Sabbath over 20 years now. It's like I think it in my mind, but my body literally doesn't let me do it. So I'll come into Sunday thinking, maybe if I just do a little work, that'll really help me for next week. And it never happens because my body won't allow it. My body is so deep into this rhythm now.
Wow. I
Mhm.
just love that whole
Mhm.
answer. That actually happened to me this past Sunday.
Yeah.
So
And
I
your body
relate.
leads you and says, nope, your mind might be thinking this is a good idea, but your body knows it's not.
Yes, my body was like, no, we're not going to do it.
We're not doing that.
So this is a great question here is
Mhm.
how can we distinguish between rest and non-rest activities? Like, for example, running is rest and running
Yes,
is
yes.
exercise.
That is a really, really good question. And the answer to that is that we're going to have to do some real discernment around this and be really, really honest. So we are going to have to do discernment around what is work for me. So I'm a writer, and a lot of my work is done on computer. So I know that opening a computer can't ever be rest for me. That opening a computer means I'm opening myself up to the temptation to want to work. And also, if I open up email, that I'm opening myself up to the agendas other people might have for me versus my commitment to be at rest. It just takes me right into every aspect of my work life. So I don't open a computer. And now I realize that some people have email on their phones. I don't do that for this very reason, because I don't want my work that close to me all the time. I want there to be some opportunity to put some distance between myself and my work. So, so you're going to have to feel what is work for me. So, there's some other examples that I could give here. For some people, mowing the lawn might feel like checking something off the list, and that would be mastery. That would be productivity. I've heard some men talk about the fact that being on a riding lawnmower with the noise and that nobody else can reach them, that they actually find it to be quite restful to do mowing because they're really disconnected and can only be in their own heart and soul while they're, riding on a riding lawnmower. For some people, for whom farming or gardening is related to their work, that would be something that would be considered work and would be off limits. I am not a gardener. And so for me, being in my garden with plants and flowers and things like that, I don't do that. I don't get out there and putz around in my garden during the other 6 days of the week. But on the Sabbath, to go out there into the garden and be surrounded by that beauty, and every single season, the garden's doing something different that says something to me about the spiritual life. And the beauty of it too. I think we all respond to nature and beauty. And so there's something very enlivening about that, but you have to discern it. I had to really figure out what are the finer nuances of that for me. And I agree with you that running could be, if you're doing it, you know, for mastery, that would be one thing. But then there are other people for whom running or a long bike ride or something like that, during the week, we don't have time for things like that. But on the Sabbath, to take a longer run or a longer bike ride and maybe to take it slower, or to go for a walk that doesn't have the destination. So you take a slow prayer walk versus that fast walk that's supposed to, be doing something for you. The endorphins, we know that exercise gives us really good endorphins. And so that's another gift we might want to find a way to receive on the Sabbath, because the endorphins are so good for us and can actually lift moods and elevate our thinking and things like that. So we're going to have to discern that for ourselves. What's really happening here? Am I working, or am I doing something that really is delight and pleasurable for me right now? Something that feels like a gift to me. And only we're going to know that. And we're going to have to discern that with God, I think, and try not to get a twofer. I think I've had many experiences where I'm trying to get a twofer. I'm going to read this book. Yeah, I love to read, so it's going to be pleasurable, but it's also on my book list, and I need to read it for some seminar that I'm giving later on. And that in that way, I'm kind of fooling myself and deceiving myself into getting a twofer, because there's a little bit of mastery there. I want to check this off my list. I need this in order to do a good job on that seminar. There's a little bit of productivity in there, achievement. So I need to be really careful even about what I read on the Sabbath. For me, I deal in the spiritual life. And so I have to be really careful that I don't allow some of my spiritual reading to actually be achievement oriented on the Sabbath.
Oh, I feel called out on that one.
Yes, yes.
So here's another great question. How can I encourage my classmates in keeping the Sabbath without being preachy or legalistic?
Yeah. Well, I like this question because it does get at the communal nature of it all, which we haven't talked much about. You asked me it, but I didn't get to that part of your question before. So I'll use this as a moment to draw attention to the fact that the Sabbath is intended to be a communal discipline, that the Sabbath was not given to an individual. It was given to the community of the Israelites. And the only reason they were able to be so successful with it, or maybe I should just say effective with keeping Sabbath, is because they did it together, is because their whole culture supported each and every one of them in keeping the Sabbath. The fact that none of their stores were open, the fact that nobody was working, you weren't withdrawing from your culture, you were actually participating in a cultural practice. And I think that there's something there for us that we do need to find and cultivate communities that are willing to enter into Sabbath keeping with us. Certainly our families or the people that we live with. I think that's the first group to enter into. And then when I was first practicing Sabbath in my early 40s, my version of this is that I had children. I had a husband and children, and they were not so attracted, to Sabbath. And so what I needed to do at that time, I decided I wasn't going to foist it on my children because they were old enough to have their own priorities, and I didn't want them to feel like something was being foisted on them that took something from them that they weren't willing to give up. I didn't want them to feel what I had felt about Sabbath keeping when I was a child. So I chose not to foist it on our family, but I chose to practice it in a really winsome way, living that with them together in the house. So I told them about God's invitation to me into Sabbath keeping, and that I felt very much like that's what God was doing in my life, and that I wanted to say yes to this invitation from God. And so I told them what things I would be including and what things I would be excluding, which challenged them, because I told them we won't be doing shopping on the Sabbath. We're not going to do wedding planning. We're not going to do financial stuff. And even at one point I said, we had daughters who are athletes, and I said, you know what? It's not very restful for me to be packing up water bottles and coolers and driving around trying to find an isolated soccer field, sitting with on the sidelines and, visiting that is not restful for me. That's not going to be replenishing. So if you can get a ride to the soccer game, you're welcome to play soccer on Sundays, because that was their priority and I wasn't going to foist it on them. But I won't be doing that on the Sabbath, because that's not restful for me. And I do feel God inviting me into rest one day a week. And, over time, it did become a really winsome invitation to my husband. We now practice it religiously, pardon the pun, together. And then eventually the girls, as they got older, they began to incorporate it into their own lives, not because I had foisted it on them, but because they saw how beautiful it was for my life. And so I think I think the idea of telling classmates what you're doing and why, and keeping it very invitational and saying, hey, if you want to join me in trying to figure this out and living into this together, that's great. But I just want you to know what I'll be doing. And I can assure you that when your classmates start to see the delight that you're having on that day, there's a good chance that many will want to try because they see the goodness of it.
I love that. We unbelievably already are really at our closing time just about. So I'd love to give you the floor to whatever last parting words that you feel impressed to share with us and upon us. And maybe if you would be okay when you finish that, if you would say a prayer over us.
Yeah. Well, maybe one thing I would invite us into at the end of this conversation is to pay attention to resonance and resistance. Both of those are very spiritual dynamics. Resonance is the sense of a warm, yes, I want that. That makes sense to me. Resistance is, what is she talking about? How in the world could this be a possibility for my life? And especially, paying attention to desire and longing and resonance can be the energy that you might need to change your life in some positive ways. I think that human desire is one of the strongest motivators that we have to access. Oughts and shoulds don't do any good at all, but true longing and desire can actually guide you into a way of life that works for you. And if there's resistance, that's something else to pay attention to too, because that might be a place where God is knocking on some closed door of your life, some way in which you are grandiose or resistant to what God knows about you that you're not willing to accept yet, or trust, where you say, I don't think I do trust God. Like I've been talking about Sabbath being an exercise in trust. And maybe your resistance is, well, you know what? The truth is, I don't trust God with my life. I trust my ability to get stuff done. That's what I really trust. Well, that's a great, honest, open place to be with God. What's God going to do with that? Facing the impossibility and being with that with God. I think those are what I would be inviting people who have been listening to actually reflect on, and to ask yourself, what is it that's going on inside me that causes me to resist such a good gift, a gift that my Creator knows that I need? What's going on inside me that causes me to not want to reach out and receive that gift, and to let that be a place of spiritual reflection, and also perhaps a place of spiritual conversation with others who are with you in whatever aspect, whatever level of your vocation you're in right now, whether you're a student or someone who's actively practicing. Is there anybody around you that you could have a spiritual conversation with them about this invitation, God's invitation to Sabbath keeping, because God knows that this is what we need because God created us. I think for all of us as leaders, we tend towards grandiosity until God knocks us off our horses. Don't wait for God to have to knock you off your horse like God had to knock me off my horse because I was so willful and grandiose. Maybe let God speak to you now before you have to get knocked off your horse. That would be my final word.
Oh, I love those final words. I'm going to be doing
Yes.
some self-reflection, and I love the whole point about then bringing others into that.
Yes, into that conversation. And so I would like to leave us with a prayer that's found in the book, but that's also a poem. And that will be the way that I'll close. So let's drop down from head to heart now for a minute, because poetry helps us with that. And let's see what this poem might do in terms of stirring our own longing and desire. There have to be times when you light a candle and find the tender place inside you that loves or sorrows or sings, and you pray from that place. Times when you let yourself feel, when you allow tears to come rather than blinking them back because you don't have time to cry. There have to be times to sink into the soft body of yourself and love what you love simply because love itself is a grace. Times when you sit with gratitude for the good things of your life that get lost and forgotten in the rush of things. There have to be times to celebrate and play, to roll down hills, to splash in water or make leaf piles, to spread paint on paper or walls or each other. There have to be times to sit and wait for the fullness of God that replenishes us, body, mind, and soul, if you can even stand to be so full. There has to be time for the fullness of time, for Sabbath time, or time is meaningless.